Greetings, classists, from whatever cohort you may be from, except maybe Y cohort. There's something a bit dodgy about them. Anyway, let's get started with the Odyssey Book 1, or, as I like to call it, Everyone Hates Telemachus, because why would you love Telemachus? Mimi, what do you think of Telemachus? See, no response, nothing, not a fan. Right, so a little starter. Again, I'm sure you just skip straight through these if you're doing the video lesson, but why not? So the first question, what is love? That's quite a complex one to think about. Actually get the brain fired up, and something that will actually be a little bit more relevant perhaps in the second year. We don't explore the types of love in great depth, but it does appear in literature and drama, and the one that I think the video screen is blocking out. If ghosts exist and they can walk through walls, why don't they just fall through floors? A conundrum, easily solved by saying they don't exist, but there we go. So, warm your brains up. What are your answers to those questions? And then, right, so what I would like you to do now is a quick 20-question test on the Odyssey. So I will upload it with the assignment, and I would like you to do it without reference to the text and without reference to the answers. Obviously I'll have to provide them, and obviously you can cheat, but I trust you not to. And remember, this is fundamentally for you. At the end of it all, you're only cheating yourselves. It's true. And so when you mark it, I do want you to bear that in mind. You should be getting 16 out of 20. These are the sort of big key points of book 1. You should have read it 2 or 3 times by now. You've already done some kind of, not quite tests, but short answer questions on it. So 16 out of 20 is the level of knowledge that you would need to have to do well in the exams. Now, there's no reason why you shouldn't all really be getting 20. There's no deep, complex questions there where you might drop a mark through misunderstanding the question. It's all simple factual stuff. So really you should be going for 20, but in terms of a pass mark, let's say 16 out of 20. So stop the video and have a go at the test with the Word documents attached. Good, well done. What did you get? 16, 17, 18, 19, 20? What did you get, Mimi? She got 20, and if my cat can get 20, so can you. Right, now a quick reminder before we start analysing the text in depth. How important are the following to individuals and society? Xenia, Kleos, Time, and female chastity. What do you think? I would jot down a few things and stop the video and see if what you've put down is broadly corresponds with the points I'm going to put across in a bit. Plenty of scope for disagreement, if you like, but I would hope you've got the broad concepts. So, how important is Xenia? Well, as we've said before, Xenia is the fundamental moral principle, social principle of the Odyssey. Without Xenia, society collapses. It is such an important societal value that it's backed up by the gods, Zeus, Xenios himself. So Xenia is crucial in a mortal world and in an immortal world as well, or rather, it references the immortal world. Now, do the gods have to follow the rules of Xenia? Well, that's something we will look at much later on. So we know Xenia is fundamental to society. What about Kleos? Well, again, Kleos is fundamental to society. Your glory and the way that glory is transmitted down through your family line. It is your way, your means of staying immortal, if such a thing can happen. And I think in a sense it can. You think, we still to this day talk of Odysseus and Achilles and Agamemnon, and we continue their kleos through our discussions of them. So if you take away someone's kleos or threaten someone's kleos, then you are threatening their immortality, and that is absolutely fundamental to Homeric hero and the society in which they operated. Cleos has been deeply offended, and so she's gone. Right, Time. So similar in a sense to Cleos, but this idea of honor, often through material wealth, through your importance being recognized by gifts and money and sacrifice, if you're a god. So again, it's a crucial value. Basically, how rich you are is how honored you are. I think a slight oversimplification, but not much. And so if someone is taking away your wealth, then they are taking away your honor. And finally, female chastity. Remember, the purity, if you like, of women is absolutely fundamental to the existence of society, certainly from a male heroic perspective. If there is any sense that your wife has been unfaithful, then your whole world is thrown into chaos and confusion. Are your children really yours? Is she really looking after your best interests when you travel? Is she trying to bring a new partner into the house and replace you? So female sort of sexual chastity and loyalty, if you like, the loyalty that springs from that, are again crucial to society, certainly from a hero's perspective. So just a quick reminder of those key events or ideas. Now, one of the things that you had to do for homework was look at the mark scheme and come up with some examples, some ideas of where we see what it is the exam board want to examine. So when you were looking through, did you find any examples in book 1 of the structure and the plot of the epic? Did you find examples of epic language or formula, be it flashback or long speeches? You may not have done. I hope you all noticed, even if you didn't know the name of the technique, that the story starts chronologically very close to the end. Odysseus is almost actually home at this point, and we don't start on the beach at Ithaca when Odysseus almost ploughs through Telemachus. We start with Odysseus actually on a beach somewhere else within weeks of making it home. So we have started in the middle of things. An interesting technique that causes a whole variety of interesting effects potentially. So as you are reading through all of the books, you will need to take notes and extract quotes and give thought to these core principles that the exam board is after. So number 1 is literary techniques, and that can be broken down into a variety of things, as we've sort of mentioned. It's structure, it's plot, it's language, and it's the much more English lit type thing. So flashbacks, semantic fields, all those different literary techniques that create a picture, both on a large scale and on a smorge scale. I don't even know what that means. What was I even saying? Well, I was saying small, but I don't know. Anyway, let's move on. So, literary techniques and composition. If you see something that is significant from that perspective, then jot it down. The next big area is heroism and the nature of heroism. So the concepts and values that make up hero, the way they manifest themselves in society, and that can be, this is a big chunk of things. It can be how they deal with minor characters, how they deal with women, how they deal with disguise and recognition, because remember, for a Homeric hero, disguising yourself is a big deal because you're losing Kleos. It is fundamental in the Homeric world that everyone knows who you are at all times. So to disguise your identity for any meaningful period of time is quite a complex thing. So anyway, I'm not going to go through every single point on that list, but that's a good list to refer to. So if you're reading through the Odyssey for homework, book 6, 7, 8, 14, whatever it might be, and you see a scene where a character is adopting a disguise or is moving towards being recognized, or there is an intervention of the supernatural, you know that these are all extremely important things that will be good examples to know, especially with a view to how they help create this heroic world. Now there's a third bullet point, which is that of society, the nature of society that these Homeric heroes operate in. So slaves, women, a bit more of the context, if you like. Now I think the heroic world and societal context I don't know if they're necessarily very clean things that you can separate. But anyway, this is what the exam board have done. I wouldn't worry about it as long as you understand the bullet points and the general principles that they are driving towards. Good. So, some very, very important things to make sure you are aware of. First of all, in class, as we go through, we highlight some key passages and examples. Now, obviously, I really try and get the main ones, and I really try and make it so that you could absolutely write the, whatever essays you are faced with at the end of 2 years, just from the examples that we've talked through in depth and talked through in detail. But you do need to go beyond that. I will pick out passages and we'll analyze them and we'll talk about them, and I'll try and pick out different types of passages that deal with different things and give you the kind of framework of principles. So if we look at a divine intervention passage, we'll talk about its significance, and you can then apply those skills or that similar format to another divine intervention passage that we don't necessarily cover in depth or at all. So what we cover in class is not all you need to know. You will need to know the rest of the book. Now, the idea is that obviously the key passages you can learn in a bit more detail. You're not expected to know every word of the Odyssey inside out, but don't be deceived into thinking that all we cover in class is all you need to know. In theory, part of the exam could be based on a passage we just haven't looked at in class. It will be one of the set books, and I would have told you to read the book, and I'd have probably asked you some short questions on it, but it might be a passage that we just haven't had time to cover in depth, or I didn't think was going to be that significant, but that doesn't mean the exam board won't. And again, don't worry, you'll have the conceptual framework to analyze it and understand its importance, and it won't be a problem at all. But just be prepared. Understand that you have to know a lot of this book yourself, and this being sixth form, you will need to take a bit of responsibility for that. So, but it's all good. Again, it's just stuff I make you aware of, and some students get a little bit stressed or panicked every year, and there is absolutely no need. If you do the work in class, if you do the homework, you will be absolutely fine. You will smash the exam and gain kleos for your family that can be passed on through the generations. So let's make a start on our analysis of the Odyssey. So the Odyssey starts with what is called the proem, and that is if you look in your book, in your text, it's the italicized introductory paragraph that is a little bit different in style to the rest of the Odyssey, and it's called the proem, and it is an interesting stylistic device to start. So what I want you to think about is, what is the impact of the proem, and would it have spoiled the story for the audience? By all means, have a little flick through it. Well, I would have a flick through it unless you know the poem off by heart, and jot down a few answers to those questions, and we will talk about them in a bit. So, be interesting to see what you have got. Anyway, we'll throw out a few ideas, and these can always be expanded upon, developed. It's the beauty or curse of literary analysis is that you can write pages and pages and pages on a single sentence or single word, and it can all be valid. And obviously, the nature of analysis changes over years. People's perceptions change, and that can be good because it means almost any coherent argument backed up by reference to the passage will get you marks. On the other hand, it can terrify the completists amongst you who want to know the right answer, because fundamentally there isn't one. There's probably some wrong answers. If you're starting to write about lizard people, then yes, you've probably wandered too far off track, even by the standards of literary analysis, but there is flexibility there. So what is the impact of the proem as this little introduction? Well, there's a few important points. I think the narrator, by saying, "Tell me, Muse, the story of that resourceful man," is highlighting the importance of the story, highlighting the skill with which it's going to be told. So remember, the Muses, these gods or goddesses really that inspire poets. This is a divine story. This is an important story. This is an amazing story, because the narrator is asking the muse to actually tell it herself, and that's quite important. In a sense, in theory, these are the words of the goddess. So, does what we hear after this stage, or is what we hear after this stage, actually the words of a goddess, or is it a human narrator? It's not entirely clear, and that does actually have a lot of relevance, especially when we get into some of the throughout the story, but once we get into the middle of the poem, when we have Odysseus telling a story as well, it all starts to get a little bit Inception, where you've got stories within stories within stories, but that's very much the nature of the work. So what else is raised in this proem? Well, we have this very brief breakdown of who Odysseus is and what he did. He saw many cities, he suffered much anguish, and he failed to bring his comrades home, the members of his crew and the members of his army, because of the poor decisions that they made in spite of Odysseus's efforts. So again, we've got this idea of free will being raised and fate, and that's obviously quite an interesting and important point, and something that would have been, well, it's still worthy of discussion now, but something that would have been really worthy of discussion in the ancient world and to the audience. To what extent are you completely bound by fate, and to what extent do you have the freedom to make your own decisions? Can you avoid suffering? If everything you do is fated in this sort of mechanistic way, does right or wrong exist? Can you avoid suffering? Can you really gain kleos? All these sorts of things. Whereas if fate is a slightly looser concept where people do have free will, then your decisions matter. Now, for the ancient Greeks, it's a slightly tricky one, because even if you're fated to commit a crime and you commit it, you still hold all the moral responsibility for that crime and are punished accordingly. For us, in a modern sort of philosophical sense, we would probably say, well, if you're fated to commit it and you have no free will and you have no choice, then you can't be held morally responsible. But that's not so in the Greek world. Another thing I would point out is that Homer doesn't necessarily have a crystal clear, well-developed concept of fate and free will that stands up to philosophical examination. Sorry. So, an important thing to think about. But would this have spoiled the story for the audience? So you're sitting down and you're waiting for the poem to start, and the first thing the narrator, author, poet says is, "Oh, Odysseus went on this really tricky journey. All his men died, but he got back safely." And you go, "Oh, really?" That's kind of taken the tension out of it. But I would argue that it absolutely doesn't. First of all, everyone would have known the story of Odysseus anyway. It would have been much more the details that the poet was filling in and playing with and altering and making their own. So, it's not as though people would have been greatly surprised by that. I think the other thing is, if you think about all of these, think of your favourite sort of superhero movie or something along those lines, you know full well that the hero is not going to die. But that doesn't make the film less exciting when the film explores how the hero achieves success. So think of it like that. Knowing the ending in broad outline doesn't necessarily reduce the tension of the story. So I would say the proem doesn't spoil anything for the audience. Now, there's another interesting concept or issue raised by the proem, and perhaps that question is, why have a narrator at all? Why make it clear that the poem is being narrated? Because remember, the poem is being performed by a poet. So why does the poet have to then pretend to be a narrator on top of that? So you've got a poet pretending to be a narrator telling the story. So there's all sorts of levels of removal. And why is that? Well, one interesting idea is one from a chap called Richardson, whose name I've blocked with the screen. And that is a book, or rather a chapter of a book that he wrote called The Devious Narrator. And this can be quite a brain-scrambling idea. And that is the idea, in essence, although you can look at it in a little bit more detail in the extract up there, the narrator of the Odyssey doesn't always tell the truth. The narrator of the Odyssey misleads, misdirects, and outright lies. So perhaps that introduces, going back to the poem in a sense, perhaps that introduces a sense of sort of tension, because even though at the beginning the narrator is saying, well, Odysseus survives and his men die and all of these sorts of things, do we even believe them? Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, Richardson describes a steady barrage of false leads and other forms of dishonesty on the narrator's part, giving the Odyssey's audience a sense of the uncertainty and mistrust that pervade the world their characters inhabit. So Richardson is saying that the author is deliberately misleading, deliberately confusing, maybe even lying, in order to give you that sense of chaos that Odysseus experiences himself when talking to individuals, and when individuals themselves experience when talking to Odysseus. So this can be quite a tricky concept, because we tend, although it's not universal, we tend to view narrators as people telling the truth. I'm sure there'll be works of English literature where they don't, but it's quite an interesting thing to get your head around, the false narrator, the liar, the devious narrator, as Richardson would call it. Now, just a point to make there, I wouldn't get too hysterical about that and say, well, the narrator is lying about everything, therefore nothing means everything. Nothing means anything, therefore I'm not going to read the book and I'm going to lock myself in a dark room for a week. No, I would never take it that far. Obviously we have to assume some truth, if not a large portion of truth, from the narrator in order to be able to function. So how does the book start? Well, it starts with this interesting technique. It starts in the middle of things, in media res, and that means in the middle of things in Latin. So as we've spoken about before, it's not a chronologically simple start. We start with Odysseus not at home. We know actually he's on the beach, sort of sobbing as he stares out to sea when we get to Book 5. But this is very close to Odysseus's return. We're not starting at the beginning. And what impact does that have? Well, it's quite an interesting one, as we'll see when we go through books 1, 2, 3, and 4. First of all, you could argue it builds tension, especially by ignoring, in a sense, Odysseus. We're wondering, well, where exactly is he? What exactly is he doing? We've got a vague idea of where he might be, but we don't know it in great depth. And this constant delay to the introduction of Odysseus is is tense. It's exciting. At the same time, books 1 to 4 do remind you of the whole story by visiting past heroes, heroes of Troy. And so remember, the audience know all of the stories. So when Telemachus visits Nestor and Menelaus, and when they tell their stories of Troy and journeys, we, in a strange sense, we have got that kind of chronological story, that reminder of how events have unfolded, even though the Odyssey doesn't describe them. Well, rather, it describes them perhaps in that way, but it doesn't. That's not how the story is chronologically in the Odyssey, if that makes any sense. The other impact of this idea of starting in media res, in the middle of things, is that the tension, the excitement is just there instantly, especially as we're starting towards the end. Because again, with that little bit of foreknowledge from the audience, they know, and especially after book 1, they know of the tensions on Ithaca. Straight away, we know Penelope is under threat, so Odysseus' lineage is under threat. Telemachus is under threat. Odysseus' Kleos is under threat. Pretty much from the first few pages, we've had Homer point out, the most terrible problem, the complexity, the things that Odysseus has to solve, the disaster that's awaiting to happen. Whereas if you started way back at the beginning, and you go through Troy and he goes into Troy and out of Troy and all these sorts of things, it's harder to build up to the tension of Odysseus's return home. Whereas straight away, we know the danger. Odysseus must get back before everything falls apart. Boom. May agrees. So let's have a look at the first little extract that I really want to talk through, and that is Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, and the story of them as told on line 36 by Zeus. Now remember, the audience would, of course, the moment you say Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, it would be like saying Robin Hood or King Arthur. The audience have already go, okay, bing, I know the story, I know the main points, there's a lot of emotion attached to it. I know the point that is trying to be made here, even though Homer doesn't actually tell the story of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra in any great depth. So Zeus is talking about Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, and he does come up with one of the most important, and that most important quote is the first part of his speech. What a lamentable thing it is that men should blame the gods and regard us as the source of their troubles, when it's their own transgressions which bring them suffering that was not their destiny. So what Zeus is saying is that men often blame the gods and say, oh, well, this horrible thing that's happened to me is fated, whereas actually they're being punished for a free will choice. And the prime example of that is Aegisthus. And he then tells briefly the story of, or reminds us of the story of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus and Agamemnon, and of course Orestes, the avenging son. So how does this story instantly create tension? How does this story use contrast, and which important moral issue is raised by just this mention of Clytemnestra, Aegisthus, Agamemnon, and Orestes? Well, one could argue that it creates tension straight away because it reminds us of what happens when a hero comes back from Troy and things have gone wrong. And that's all very applicable to Penelope and Telemachus. Penelope is under threat. Odysseus' kingdom is under threat. Odysseus' Kleos is under threat. The story of Agamemnon is that classic story of the consequences of leaving your kingdom. So Agamemnon left for 10 years, and Clytemnestra gets out of control and manipulates Aegisthus into basically taking Agamemnon's throne, and then, according to this version of the story, killing Agamemnon himself. So, to what extent is Penelope going to do that? Clytemnestra's been maybe forced into it by Agamemnon's behaviour with Iphigenia, his daughter, and his general neglect of her, and perhaps some of his actions when he walks home or comes home and has got Cassandra with him, and doesn't seem to give that much of a shit about Clytemnestra. But I mean, probably not, because at that point she's already with Aegisthus, and her plan is pretty much formed. So this story creates tension because we ask ourselves the question, what is Penelope going to do? What is Telemachus going to do? What is going to be the consequences for Odysseus' kingdom? How does it use contrast? Well, this is quite an interesting one. I think it's well worth drawing a little diagram or table, because even though they are very similar characters in many ways, in many circumstances, actually they're really quite different. So Clytemnestra is, in a sense, the ultimate in chaotic political female evil. She usurps her husband. She takes political power in her kingdom, and that is a terrifying thing for an ancient Greek and a Homeric hero. She doesn't support her husband, and that is a fundamental duty of a wife, that of supporting your husband politically and socially, and so on and so forth. And Clytemnestra does none of those things. Now, as a modern audience, we tend to, in some ways, we're a little bit more forgiving of her because of the sort of, Agamemnon's brutal murder of his daughter. But the Greeks were less traumatized by that, but they still strongly felt that, irrespective of what Agamemnon had done, Clytemnestra still needed to do her duty as a heroic wife, that of supporting her husband politically, socially, and so on and so forth. So we also get a contrast between Agamemnon and Odysseus. So Agamemnon, the slightly thick, brutish, simple warlord, who isn't, he is considered a great hero, but intellectually nothing compared to Odysseus. So Agamemnon goes home and is brutally murdered, but it raises that issue, that problem. How can a hero get home safely? What should they do once they are home? And actually, half of the book, is it about right? Yeah, half of Homer's Odyssey really is Odysseus and the way he deals with his homecoming. In theory, he'd like to step off the boat and be welcomed by a roaring crowd, but that's not what happens. We also get this very important contrast with between Orestes and Telemachus. An interesting one. Orestes is a young son who does the right thing in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. He has grown up in many ways without his father, and so has Telemachus. But the approaches to situations are quite different. Orestes does what needs to be done. He kills his mother, even though he knows that will bring great suffering on him. Telemachus doesn't do anything. And we see in the beginning, even though Odysseus' kingdom is under great threat, Telemachus is sitting there whining about it rather than actually doing anything until Athene intervenes. Now, which moral issue is important? Well, this is fate and free will, and we've talked about that. And Zeus himself makes it clear. Sometimes people do things, they blame the gods, and it was their own free will that got them, free will choices that got them punished. But again, the tricky question: to what extent is Zeus lying about that? So on to our next passage or point for discussion. Now I will talk about areas either side of these passages. So at the top, did I make it clear? Probably not. There are line numbers for the specific things that I'm referring to. and you should see those in the margins of your books. So the next thing we're looking at is Athene's journey. Now before this, Athene is actually given quite a clever, persuasive speech to her father Zeus and asked him to release Odysseus from captivity from the island of Calypso. So Athene gives a speech that is quite persuasive, quite manipulative, and very, very similar in tone and style to Odysseus. So you can see straight from the word go why they're so similar. So anyway, Odysseus persuades Zeus, who doesn't need much persuading. He's been desperate to free Odysseus, but Poseidon has stopped him, and depending on how you view it, perhaps fate has stopped him as well. But anyway, the situation is right for Odysseus to be released, or at least urged on his way. So Zeus agrees to send Hermes, and Athene goes down to see Telemachus, and she does that by getting dressed, getting prepared in a very sort of human way, and travelling in person to Ithaca to Telemachus. So our first question, what does this passage say about the nature of the gods? It shows that they are bound by their bodies in a sense. And again, one thing I'd make very clear is that in Homer and in the Greek world as well, they have stories, they have traditions, they have ideas about the gods, but they don't have a Bible and they don't have a papacy. So there's all sorts of competing and varied traditions about the nature of gods, about stories of gods, about the underworld, about the afterlife. They follow very similar threads, and in many cases they're very, very similar, if not the same. But there's plenty of scope for difference as well. Now, did you spot this is actually Loki and not Meme? So anyway, there's a lot of scope for difference. But as a good general rule, gods are confined to a body, and although they have super senses, almost superpowers, they are constrained in a sense by a body. So they're aware of what they can see, and then not aware of what they can't see. And thus we see at the very beginning, this is highlighted at the very beginning, when Poseidon goes off to have a barbecue with the Ethiopians, and thus his attention is diverted from Odysseus, and so the whole thing can come into play, or unfold rather. So this scene does show, it's not a massive scene, but it is interesting. It shows that Athene gets dressed and has to go. Hermes does something similar later on. He has to go and travel and see and speak to Calypso to get Odysseus released. There isn't this sort of divine universal presence and God can just manifest in your mind or anything along those lines. Gods have a body that has to travel. So when Athene arrives in Ithaca dressed as or wearing the sort of form of Mentes, we then get our first depiction of the suitors. Now remember, the audience would of course known the rough outline of the story anyway, but suitors in past myth have been dangerous too. Remember the whole Trojan War, well, not Trojan War, but one of the would you say it was a cause? Anyway, it's up to you. But remember, think back to the wedding of Tyndareus and Helen, where there's a problem with suitors. How do you disperse a large crowd of suitors without causing problems? And Odysseus comes up with his clever oath trick, and then that does lead to them all having to go off and fight at Troy. So anyway, the point I'm getting across is that it's well known that a large crowd of suitors or heroes in one place all competing for the same thing causes problems, be it a woman, be it the armour of another hero, be it particular honour. This is a known and recognised problem in this ancient world. So when Athene appears and sees the suitors, we know, oh, this is a dangerous, tricky, complicated situation. And then when we see what the suitors are doing, we have an even further characterization of them and their negativity. So they are eating lavishly, they're preparing meat, they're playing games, they're lounging around at the expense of another man who isn't there. So straight away we get an understanding of their erosion of the Time, the Kleos, and maybe even the lineage of Odysseus. So we know almost from the word go the suitors are bad news, and that's reinforced by their depiction, their initial depiction in the Odyssey. So just a quick pseudo starter, if you like. Skip this one if you don't want to do it, but it's just really getting you to think about what would be expected of a young man in a modern era, and then we'll talk about a young man in the Bronze Age era in a bit. But what would you expect a 20-year-old man to be like in modern Britain with regard to parental relationships, how the public perceive them, and their authority in the family home? There we have on the bed a typical 20-year-old man passed out with a laptop and beer or cigarettes or something. Anyway, feckless youth. So the important bit, what would you expect a 20-year-old man to be like in Bronze Age Greece with regard to parental relationships, public perception of them, and authority in the family home? Well, I think the point that we really want to get across here is that a 20-year-old man in Bronze Age Greece would probably not be head of their family. They would be being prepared to be head of their family, but fundamentally their parent, their father, would be in complete control of almost everything they did. He would decide who they went to war with and who they went to war against, and he would decide who they marry, and the hero, the father, would decide everything that went on in the household. And whilst the 20-year-old man would have less authority in the household than his father, it would be pretty substantial. You know, the slaves, the women, everyone in the household would be expected to obey the son unless the father kind of contradicted that or countermanded that, which he could, absolutely. And the father's word was absolute law. So 20-year-olds in the ancient world occupy a slightly strange zone in that by the age of 20, you know, you could well have been fighting on the battlefield for 4 years and have had quite a rich and varied life. And by the age of 20, you may have been married, although men tended to marry much later when they'd established themselves. But you know, it would not be impossible for you to, by the age of 20, have done 4, maybe 5 years of fighting and have a wife and a couple of kids. That wouldn't necessarily mean you were sorry. It wouldn't necessarily mean you were independent of your father, and you would still very much be living in his household and obeying his word. So really what we're looking at, or the point we're trying to discuss, is to what extent does Telemachus meet this criteria? So we see Telemachus and Athene appears, and Telemachus in our introductory scene responds in some ways quite well. So what Telemachus does well is the performance of Xenia. So he notices that Mentes is there, or Athene dressed as Mentes is there, and he understands the importance of showing good Xenia. So straight away that characterizes him as a good character in the Odyssey, a noble character in the Odyssey. So he rushes up and does all the appropriate things. He organizes food, a drink, and a bath, or the facility to wash for Mentes, and once he's had those, only then does he ask him questions. Now, when Telemachus notices Mentes, he is afraid of shame. You know, he is deeply ashamed that this stranger has been left waiting outside, even for the smallest amount of time, maybe even a slightly exaggerated response. You know, Mentes isn't exactly, you know, asleep on the step having been left there for hours, but you know, Telemachus's Xenia at least is impeccable. So to what extent does Telemachus meet our expectation of a Homeric hero? Well, in many ways, not a lot. So he does show good Xenia, but in almost every other way, he is pretty pathetic. And the reason for that is obvious. He has grown up without a father. He has grown up without a hero to bring him up. Telemachus has been brought up by his mother and by a slave, and as a result doesn't seem to be showing those male heroic characteristics. He's a little weak, he's a little pathetic, he's 20, he's stropping around, whinging and whining about suitors, but fundamentally not doing anything about it. Now, are we being a little bit harsh? Well, possibly, but think about what Orestes did. A child or person of more or less the same age. He took action straight away and killed his mother, even though he knew this would bring about the wrath of the gods, because honor was so important. And what does Telemachus do? Does he take on a room full of suitors and die gloriously because that is more important? No, he sort of whinges and rather pathetically hangs around waiting for someone else to intervene. And intervene Athene does. So Athene has appeared and prophesied or predicted the return of Odysseus, and Telemachus' response is again quite whiny and pathetic, and he goes on and on about how Odysseus has met a dreadful fate and a horrible end, and how he's lost or perhaps dead. I don't think he quite clearly and explicitly says dead, but he certainly seems to suggest it in a lot of his descriptions of where he thinks Odysseus is. So Telemachus has more or less given up hope. And Athene plays a very crucial role in giving him hope, in energizing him and making him understand that actually there is things to play for. So perhaps Athene needs to do this to ensure that Ithaca doesn't fall before Odysseus gets back, because things are reaching that climactic point. And one of the points of, I was going to say something that probably wouldn't have worked as a sensible phrase. Okay, one of the sort of most important sort of areas of tension is that of Penelope and remarriage, and Telemachus has mentioned this problem before. He says that Penelope is struggling to decide whether she should remarry, and if so, who, and she's trying to put it off. But at some point, Penelope will have to choose, especially if she doesn't get word of Odysseus. Now, it's all very well being faithful, but as you can see, the suitors are taking all of Odysseus's resources and food and taking everything away from Telemachus. And the moment Penelope chooses a suitor and marries, then perhaps there'd be some break for Telemachus, because Penelope would take her property that she brought to the marriage, but Odysseus's would then be left to Telemachus. Penelope would be gone, and Telemachus would be in charge of a reduced but significant kingdom. Now, will Penelope remarry? Will she accept a suitor? This is a crucial tension, because if Penelope remarries and sleeps with someone else, or even shows too much kind of public affection for someone else, then we have that problem of chastity, of lineage, of purity, if you like. If she slept with someone else and then discovered Odysseus was still alive, there's no way back from that. Odysseus as a hero, even though it's a mistake, would probably kill her, or could well kill her. That's very much the threat that she's operating under. Now, interestingly, Menelaus doesn't kill Helen, even though he's tempted to when he takes Troy way back in the sort of the epic cycle, but not the Iliad. So even if Odysseus is alive and makes it back a week late, the whole thing could be for nothing, because with Penelope remarried, the family collapses, the state collapses, things cannot be back to how they were. If Penelope doesn't remarry and stays faithful, then things can more or less go back to how they should be, with Odysseus at the top, at the head of the family, and loyal Penelope by his side. So Athene needs to make sure that Penelope doesn't give in and Telemachus remains on side. So what does she do? Well, obviously she gives him news of Odysseus being still alive through her prophecy, and she basically says, she sort of G's him up a bit. She talks about the insolence of the suitors and how their very nature disgusts her, which is quite interesting as a god, and that's an important phrase, an important quote. Any decent man would be disgusted at the sight of such disgraceful behaviour, because Athene is appalled by what the suitors are doing, and does that therefore give Odysseus the right to kill them later on? Well, that's another debate for very much near the end of the book. So, is Athene being a little critical of Telemachus there? Well, I think she is. Any decent man would have killed them, and Telemachus hasn't, because in a sense he's not a man, and he's not allowed to be. Telemachus, does he really believe Odysseus is dead? I don't know. I don't think so. I think he's just lost in despair. And we've talked about Telemachus, Orestes, and we haven't mentioned Achilles, but I think it's again something worth thinking about. Achilles is different because he had a father, but there are young men in myth who have certainly performed better than Telemachus in trying circumstances, which is one reason why everyone hates Telemachus. So, one of the things that Athene does that's extremely important is to breathe courage and daring into Telemachus, and he doesn't seem to be particularly brave or do anything significant until Athene's intervention. Now, for many of us, that takes away from his heroic status, from the heroic message, because we always think, well, you have to do it yourself to be classed as a hero, but that's not the case in the ancient world, and this is an important concept to get across, certainly from a Homeric perspective. The divine intervening on your side makes you worthy. It doesn't take away from your heroic status. If you're fighting someone on the battlefield and a god intervenes and drives your spear into the opponent, as a pretty good general rule, that makes you worthy rather than so pathetic that you had to be helped. So it's quite a modern way of looking at it in terms of free will and divine intervention. So once Telemachus has had all of this help and spirit and courage bred into him, and they're really made aware of the change when Telemachus starts directly challenging them. He says, tomorrow I propose we all go to the assembly place so that I can formally demand that you quit my palace. So what a transformation. He's thinking about Kleos. He's going to the assembly. He's going to appeal to the people. He's highlighting the crimes of the suitors. He's become a much more heroic male figure, and he's starting to become, in theory, a son worthy of Odysseus, although one could argue he never quite gets there or even gets close. I think he's a thoroughly loathsome creature, but there you go. So after a brief exchange with the two lead suitors, and they're quite well characterized by this exchange, and Antinous being brash and strong and direct and straightforward, saying, who was that? What were they doing? He's quite aggressive and simple. And then the exchange with Eurymachus, who's a kind of evil Odysseus in some ways. He's a much more intelligent, although far inferior, hero. He tries to placate Telemachus and pretend that maybe everyone's on Telemachus's side, and that it's to some degree a misunderstanding. And we see that later on when Odysseus gets back to Ithaca. Antinous and Eurymachus adopt those roles. But we also get given a kind of face to the suitors with this brief exchange, and these two could arguably represent the suitors in terms of characterization. People who are selfish and keen on obtaining as much as they possibly can. So after that brief exchange, they go to they drink again, do what they've been doing for years, and head off to bed. And Telemachus goes to bed and starts thinking about the journey. Now, previously Athene had decided that Telemachus needed to go on a journey, and had instructed him to do so, and he accepts that this is a good idea. Now, this is again important. It's his own little Odyssey. It's his own way of gaining heroic stature and status, and it's a good way of keeping him safe, because if he's away, the suitors can't kill him, and that is a very real risk, a very real danger. So Athene's interventions in this book have been extremely important in both a thematic and a kind of plot-based sense. She's kept Telemachus safe and is now keeping him even safer. She's developing his credentials. She's developing him as a son worthy for Odysseus. So it's all good. Even though it seems like a relatively sort of slow beginning, it's not. It's quite an important one. I think also in terms of a beginning, what this has really done is emphasized the dire situation in Ithaca. It's shown you all of the threats to Odysseus as a hero: Penelope's status, his wealth, his son's life, his Kleos, his Time, the structure of Ithacan society. Especially from a Homeric audience with their understanding of the context, would have read that book and gone, wow, Ithaca's in trouble. Odysseus needs to get back there as soon as humanly possible. So, oh, sorry, I think some of the things that I was talking about there are actually a bit more applicable to this slide. So I'm sure you can cope with it. How has Telemachus's character changed, and why is it important that his character has changed? Well, again, I've just spoken about that. He's braver, he's more daring, he's more about the Kleos, he's about his own little Odyssey. He's becoming a man, and it's important that he changes to be a hero worthy of his heroic father, and also he needs to provide his father with some very practical help, which we'll see in the later books. Is Telemachus a real hero? See if you can come up with 3 points for and 3 points against. Pause the video, have a go, boom. Right, none of you pause the video, you're all sitting there with a cup of tea going, come on, get to the next slide. So we will. Is Telemachus a real hero? Well, we could say yes. He has shown great xenia to Athene, which is a key characteristic of a hero. He is a heroic father, so he has inherited the Kleos to a degree of Odysseus. He speaks in assembly, or at least he's determined to speak in assembly, and that is a great way of obtaining Kleos and status. It's not all through the battlefield. And he's visited by a goddess. The gods only visit people who are worthy of, who are of a worthy status. So a god or goddess wouldn't visit Telemachus if he didn't have a kind of heroic status, a kind of heroic importance. These are the arguments, anyway. In what sense is he not a hero? Well, he's 20, and as I've said, that's a slightly complicated age in that, if your father's still alive, you could be quite youthful and have little power in some senses. On the other hand, you'll have been living as an adult man, bar that political power, for a number of years, and he has not challenged the suitors in any meaningful way. He hasn't achieved any actions that give him Kleos, so he hasn't challenged the suitors. He hasn't been involved in a war, which is fair enough, but it's not like he's a famous hunter either, and it's not like that he has chosen to engage in politics up until Athene driving him. So he seems to have lacked any kind of drive to obtain Kleos. Third point, he isn't quite in charge of his estate. It seems actually that up until this point it's been Penelope who's been running it, and it's a tricky situation because remember, Odysseus has been away for almost 20 years and Telemachus couldn't have run it for the first 15, 16 years, but really he should have been running it for the last 4 or 5. And it's, I guess, point 4 kind of blends into that, but really up until just after or just before Athene breathes courage and daring into Telemachus, he's not doing anything. It's only after that he does, and that makes him, like I said, that does make him worthy, but the question does need to be asked, why hasn't he done it before? Now, what I'd like you to do is write a paragraph or a passage on the following question, and I would like you to make sure that you use short quotes and extracts, if you like, from the book to justify your answers. So I would suggest that you pick out, you're probably going to be looking at 4 themes. So I would hope you get 4 good, clear examples of where there are serious issues to an absence. So, for example, Xenia, come up with a nice, clear example, quoting from the book, of where there's a problem with Xenia, and answer the question: to what extent does Book 1 highlight the serious consequences of a hero's absence, thus making Odysseus central to the plot even before he appears? And that last bit's really just to get you thinking about that as a concept, because it's a bit strange that Odysseus isn't really in Book 1, yet you could argue Book 1 is all about Odysseus, in that it deals with his absence and the consequences of it. So it depends on how much you write, but I would be expecting about a page with 4 well-developed points that all clearly and directly answer the question. Now, this is an activity that could be useful. What I'd like to do is throw all of these names down on paper and then sort of spread it out, and then you'll draw links or lines between all of these various people where you can find a link. And if you are not really sure who all of these people are, then I would do it in a kind of a more simple way. So, to what extent are Odysseus and Phemius linked? Well, Phemius is Odysseus's bard. To what extent are Odysseus and Penelope linked? Penelope is Odysseus's wife. They're married. So you can keep it quite simple and factual. If you have done Book 1 inside out and you know it all quite well, what I would then make this instead is a concept map. So how are people linked conceptually? So, for example, there, Penelope and Clytemnestra, yes, well, they're linked in a sort of opposite sense, in that they are they're sort of stereotypes of women, and Penelope is a positive stereotype, if you like, or maybe the ideal, and Clytemnestra is the opposite of the ideal. So you've got Penelope, loyal, faithful, apolitical. You've got Clytemnestra, political, wild, savage, and unfaithful. So as sort of female, ideal isn't quite the right word, but I hope you know what I mean. As sort of female characterizations, they do link pretty well together. How are Telemachus and the suitors linked? So chuck all these down on a piece of paper, sort of spread out, and then they all kind of spider web together. If that doesn't make sense, then don't worry too much, but I would like you to at least have a go. Okay, that was the first video lesson for a book, and we covered a lot, and maybe a bit too much. I don't know. I have to give some thought as to how these ones work. But hopefully, sorry, the cat's going crazy. Hopefully that'll keep you going until the next lesson. Anyway, take care.